Shout out to Feminagra. I love this blog, by the way. Look, y'all know y'all got one business day to spread lies and then it gets shut down, right? You do know this isn't 2020 anymore, right? You just can't do this type of thing anymore. But let me clarify something about David Foster coming forward. And I'm only clarifying this because I know exactly why he's doing what he's doing, even though he didn't have to, because the rest of us with eyes understood, I guess, the infamous video that it was just for people trying to line up to take a picture. Have you all taken group pictures before? They can be kind of awkward because where am I standing? Who am I standing next to? Well, what do you want my hand? It's just the placement is weird. And then once you figure it out in lockstep, everybody smiles. That's how it works. And you guys took this little split second in time to make a false narrative out of it. When are you guys going to get tired? The answer is never. Because some of you monetize off of this, right? Your rent, the food on your table, your past due bills are dependent on these lies. Couldn't be me, baby. But let's get back to the matter at hand. This has been a trifecta. This has been Poe from MasterChef. This has been the host at the infamous dinner. Now it's David Foster, all clearing up tabloid speculation and bullshit. And here's the crazy part about it. I'll use Poe and David Foster as an example because they strictly, and I mean strictly, have been telling people there's no issue. Love them down. It was fantastic being around them. And of course, in the case of Poe, this was more professional and she had nothing but glowing things to say about Meghan. And when it comes to David Foster, as you guys know, or at least that's how the media paints it, that's like Harry's second father. I wish he was his real father, to be honest with you. But that's the relationship everyone has. And we all know that Catherine McPhee and Meghan were schoolmates. So I'm supposed to believe a bunch of deranged bitches on the internet over the people who are actually saying out of their mouths that there's no issue? I'm sorry, guys. I'm not that clinically insane. I'm not, and I will never be. Sorry. Once something is cleared up, you are supposed to move the fuck on, not sit there and call the people liars. So your issue isn't with Meghan because Meghan isn't forcing anyone to say anything. Come on, derangers. Meghan can't be some irrelevant ass woman today, but then tomorrow she's bullying networks and multimillionaires and moguls to defend her honor. Which one is it? Because those two things are not compatible. So here's another thing too. This Canada thing, this Commonwealth, because every time Harry and Meghan step foot on a Commonwealth, baby, they shut it down. They shut it down wherever they go. But that Commonwealth thing really rubs certain people the wrong way. Even Hello Magazine. They don't like it. It's the British Royal Family's turf. Who do you think they are? Not slaves, and they can go where the hell they want to go. But the YouTube girlies are mad because the only time they go to Canada is to get their heads rammed into a headboard at a 2-star hotel overlooking a parking lot. I know a Dave. I know a Dave. Anyway, let's get back to the matter at hand. Stop lying on David Foster. Stop lying on other people. And when people tell you that something, when an actual face and a name person tells you that something is a lie, then believe it. It's not like you derangers don't have 1,000,001 crazy ass things going on in your head. Just move on to the next thing like you always do. But you lose. Bye.
There's nothing to see here. You people are so desperate. So desperate. It seems we can't even go like a couple of days without some nonsense. There is nothing to see here. There was no SNUB. David himself has come out to set the record straight, which I commend him for doing so, and I wish a few others would as well. The man from his own mouth has said, Harry and Meghan are my dear closest friends. What do you people want at this point? What do you want? These two people cannot always just be the topic for whatever it is you people are trying to, because we don't know anymore. We don't, it just, It's so stupid. Every little detail. You make up narratives in your head about what you wish was your truth. It's not. They were even sitting at the same table. Like, okay, look, this is exhausting, but I'll never stop trying to help you understand, because clearly you guys are sick. You are actually sick in the head. You run with crazy stories in your head, and then you are left with pie on your face when the man who was hosting this event tells you, no. I like them. They're my friends. What you got now? What you got now for us? So I hope the record has been. David said, there was no snub. I am friends with the most powerful, the most influential royal couple in the world. It's that simple. I don't know what's wrong with you. Lord have mercy.
I wasn't going to talk about the story that I've been seeing for the last, 2 or 3 days. However, I saw that David Foster came out to defend his dear friends, Meghan and Prince Harry, and he gained a little bit of brownie points in my eyes. I was not a huge fan of his. I watched The Real Housewives, and the way he treated Yolanda, even though I'm not a huge fan of hers, but so rude, and I thought he was being a jerk. And then also when they supported Spencer Pratt, I was like, ew. However, I personally think that when these celebrities who don't have to, I'll let Gwyneth Paltrow, come out and defend Prince Harry and Meghan, it speaks volumes of them. This never made sense. I don't know if you saw the video, but he walks past them. Meghan's and he walks past her. It just didn't even make sense, because first of all, if he didn't like them, he didn't have to invite them. I believe this was his event. So why in the world would he invite someone who he doesn't like? The media needs to make it make sense. And also, David Foster, he's older, and it was never poised as oops, he had a senior moment. He clearly looked disorientated. In the video, I don't know if you saw it, he looked disorientated, like he was lost. It was never him. It was never that he was rude to Prince Harry and Meghan. Every single article I saw was that he was rude to Meghan, which nothing burger. So anyway, when I saw this in People Royal, I had to make a comment. I just do. And then look at what a hater said, which is you guys, the haters, being a hater is not the flex that they think it is. It blows, but I mean, then again, who's the commander-in-chief? It blows my mind, but not really, that these haters are out and proud, not realizing that they're losers. So you can read here what Demi said. First of all, my comment is in no way, shape, or form addressed to anyone. I'm not trying to convince anyone. Same thing here with my page. I've said it what feels like a million times. I like talking to people that like them. Plain and simple. But the amount of haters that I block and they come out of nowhere, it's a daily thing. And some of them, I'm like, okay, sure, you can come on here. If you feel the need to tell me you don't like them, sure. But the ones that keep going, there's a lady, a person on here that will be getting blocked here shortly, blows my mind. It's not a flex. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. You either like them or you don't. And preferably, I would like to talk to the people that like them. But like I said in the video yesterday, every single person that actually knows them has always said how lovely they are. And I wish that the haters would focus on that and not on these fake tabloid flake stories, because they're making money. The amount of people have come on here and how much are they paying you to talk about them? Literally $0. I do this because I like it. And also, like I said, I want to connect with people that like them. But do they not realize that these tabloids make millions of dollars? Hence why they keep running stories about Meghan. But I guess that would actually require thinking, and the haters don't have brains.
British media just got shut down like a rat-infested restaurant by the Board of Health. They should know what that feels like, since they are rats. Well done, Mr. Foster. Well done.
Now, Squaddies, let's slow this whole thing down for a second, because this story is actually ridiculous when you look at what we're being asked to believe. We're talking about a 2-second clip. 2 seconds. That's it. Somebody posts a tiny piece of footage from a busy red carpet, and suddenly we're supposed to believe we've witnessed the great David Foster versus Meghan Sussex showdown of the century. Come on now. Look at what a red carpet actually looks like. Cameras everywhere, flashing lights, photographers shouting names, people walking in different directions, publicists trying to move people along, security, guests coming through. Everyone is looking somewhere. It is chaos. So David Foster happens to walk through the crowd without stopping for a full conversation with Meghan in that particular second, and somehow that becomes David Foster snubs Meghan. Wait, what? Since when did failing to stop for somebody for 2 seconds become a public rejection? If we applied that standard to ordinary life, half of us would be falling out with our friends every morning. Imagine walking into the supermarket and your friend doesn't notice you. "Excuse me, I saw you look in my direction and keep walking. Our friendship is over." That's basically the logic we're dealing with here. And this is why I think regular people need to step back and ask a very simple question. Where is the actual evidence of a snub? Not the dramatic caption, not somebody's interpretation of a facial expression, not a headline screaming that Meghan was supposedly humiliated. The actual evidence. Because once you strip away all that noise, what do we really have? A short clip from a hectic event. That's it. And then David Foster himself comes along and says, in effect, hold on, that's not what happened. Now that is important, because the person who is actually involved has more information about that moment than some random account watching a 2-second video on social media. And that's where the whole thing starts falling apart. The internet can turn anything into a story. Someone looks away, they're angry. Someone doesn't smile, they're furious. Someone walks past, they've rejected you. Someone talks for 30 seconds, suddenly they're best friends. It's madness. And Meghan seems to get this treatment constantly. Everything becomes a test. Every glance becomes evidence. Every movement gets analysed like somebody is solving a murder mystery. But real life doesn't work like that. Sometimes a person simply doesn't see you. Sometimes they're distracted. Sometimes they're being pulled in another direction. Sometimes they're trying to get through a crowd without walking into a camera. And sometimes there is simply nothing happening. That's the part I think gets lost whenever Meghan is involved. People become so determined to find a negative story that a completely normal moment cannot remain normal. It has to become something. It has to become rejection. It has to become humiliation. It has to become another supposed example of Meghan being unwanted. But why? Why are we so desperate to turn an ordinary red carpet moment into a story about Meghan being rejected? That's the question I'd rather ask. Because if the original footage doesn't prove the claim, and the person involved rejects the claim, then maybe, just maybe, the story was never really there in the first place. And honestly, Squaddies, that's what makes this whole thing so frustrating. Meghan didn't need to be rescued from a snub. There was no snub to rescue her from. A completely ordinary moment was dressed up as a scandal. And once you actually look at the evidence instead of the headline, the drama starts looking very, very small. So before somebody tells you Meghan was humiliated, rejected, abandoned, or whatever dramatic word they're using this week, do one thing. Watch the footage. Then ask yourself, if Meghan wasn't in that clip, would anyone even think this was a story? Exactly. That's the point. Sometimes the biggest headline is built around this smallest moment, and this one looks like exactly that.
Now, Squaddies, this is where I think the whole story gets even more ridiculous. Because we're not talking about two strangers who happen to walk past each other at an event. We're talking about people with history. And that's the part you lose when you freeze somebody's life into a 2-second video clip. David Foster isn't some random celebrity who just met Harry and Meghan 5 minutes ago. There is an actual relationship there. According to the story we're discussing, David had previously helped Harry and Meghan when they were trying to find some privacy during that incredibly stressful period after stepping away from royal duties. He helped facilitate their stay at a private estate on Vancouver Island. Think about that for a second. This wasn't somebody who simply waved at them at a party. This was someone who was there during a major transition in their lives. And then you've got Catherine McPhee, David's wife, who already had a connection with Meghan from their school days in Los Angeles. So when I see a 2-second clip and somebody says, "Look, David is rejecting Meghan," I'm thinking, based on what? Because the history doesn't suddenly disappear because somebody didn't stop walking on a red carpet. That's not how relationships work. If you've been friends with somebody for years, one awkward moment in a crowded room doesn't suddenly erase everything that came before it. And regular people understand this. You don't need to be a celebrity to know this. We've all been there. You walk into a restaurant and don't see your friend sitting in the corner. You walk straight past them. 5 minutes later, bro, I was literally waving at you. And you're like, what? I didn't even see you. Does that mean you secretly hate each other? Of course not. Life is messy. People get distracted. People miss each other. People are talking to somebody else. People are being rushed from one place to another. That's normal human behavior. But when Meghan is involved, somehow normal human behavior gets put through a giant conspiracy machine. A person doesn't immediately acknowledge her, snubbed. Someone doesn't smile, tension. Someone walks in another direction, Meghan rejected. Please, at some point we have to use common sense. And this is why I think the actual relationship matters far more than somebody's interpretation of a few seconds of footage. Because the people who genuinely know Meghan have experienced her as a friend, a colleague, a wife, a mother, a person. They know her beyond the headlines. Meanwhile, strangers online are looking at a tiny piece of footage and acting like they've been sitting in Meghan's living room for the last 10 years. How does that work? You cannot know somebody's entire relationship with another person from one camera angle. You just can't. And that's especially important with Meghan because there has been so much effort to define her from the outside. People who don't know her personally constantly tell us what her relationships supposedly mean, who supposedly likes her, who supposedly doesn't like her, who supposedly wants nothing to do with her. And apparently we're expected to accept all of that because somebody on social media watched a 3-second clip. No, I'm sorry. I'm going to trust real history over internet body language detectives. And David Foster's response matters for exactly that reason, because when the person actually involved says there was no snub and refers to Meghan as a dear friend, that gives us something far more meaningful than somebody's dramatic caption. It reminds us that there is a real human being behind these headlines. Meghan isn't a character in somebody else's storyline. She's a person with friendships, memories, connections, and relationships that existed long before somebody decided to turn a red carpet clip into content. And honestly, Squaddies, that's the bigger lesson here. Don't let somebody else tell you what a relationship looks like when they have never been inside that relationship. Because people can manufacture a narrative in 5 minutes. Real friendships can take years to build. And you don't throw years of history out the window because someone happened to walk past someone else for 2 seconds. That's not evidence. That's just somebody trying very, very hard to make an ordinary moment mean something it doesn't. Now, Squaddies, this is where I think we have to zoom out a little bit. Because if you only look at the David Foster story by itself, you might think, okay, somebody saw a strange moment on a red carpet and wrote a story about it. But that's not really the bigger issue. The bigger issue is what that moment is being used to suggest about Meghan. Because we've seen this storyline before. Meghan is supposedly isolated. Meghan supposedly has no real friends. Meghan supposedly regrets leaving royal life. Harry and Meghan supposedly have nobody around them. And every time there's a tiny little moment that might be twisted into supporting that story, here comes the headline. That's the part that makes me raise an eyebrow. Because think about how this works in regular life. Imagine somebody in your neighborhood already decided you have no friends. Then one afternoon they see you walking into a shop by yourself. Oh my goodness, she's alone. Next day, she has no friends. Mate, she went to buy milk. What are we doing? That's basically what happens when people start with the conclusion and then go hunting for little pieces of footage to support it. The story isn't, let's watch this footage and see what actually happened. It's more like, we already know what we want people to believe. Now let's find a clip that fits. And that's a huge difference. Because if you genuinely wanted to understand what happened at that red carpet, you'd look at the full context. You'd ask what was happening around them. You'd consider the fact that these events are chaotic. And most importantly, you'd listen to the person actually involved. But instead, one tiny moment gets pulled out, given a dramatic caption, and suddenly we're talking about Meghan being supposedly rejected. Why? Because it fits the character they've already created for her. And that's what I mean when I say the narrative came first. They didn't discover that Meghan was isolated. They were looking for something that could make people believe she was isolated. That's a very different thing. And Squaddies, regular people know exactly what this looks like. We've all seen it. Somebody doesn't like you at work and suddenly everything you do gets interpreted negatively. You arrive early, she's trying too hard. You arrive late, she doesn't care. You don't talk, she thinks she's better than everyone.
You talk, she loves attention. At that point, you're not being judged on what you're actually doing. You're being judged against a story somebody has already decided is true. And that's the trap Meghan has been dealing with. If she smiles, there's supposedly a hidden agenda. If she doesn't smile, she's supposedly miserable. If she's surrounded by people, she's supposedly desperate for attention. If she happens to be standing alone for 5 seconds, she's supposedly friendless. How is anybody supposed to win that game? They've basically created a situation where the evidence doesn't matter anymore. Everything has to point back to the same conclusion. See, Meghan is isolated. No, maybe Meghan was simply standing there. Maybe somebody was walking past. Maybe the photographer captured an awkward second. Maybe nothing happened. That possibility seems to drive certain people crazy, because if the moment is actually ordinary, then there's no story. And that's why I think this David Foster situation matters beyond David Foster. It shows how easily a normal moment involving Meghan can be plugged into a much bigger storyline. The clip doesn't have to prove the entire story, it only has to look like it might. Then the headline does the rest. People read the headline, they don't watch the full footage. Someone shares the headline, another person reacts to the headline, then somebody else says, look at what's happening to Meghan. And suddenly a tiny moment has become evidence for an entire theory about her life. That's how you build a perception, one little story at a time. And here's where I think Meghan deserves some credit, because despite all of this, she keeps moving. She isn't running around trying to correct every ridiculous interpretation of her life. She isn't waking up every morning saying, right, which rumor am I supposed to destroy today? Can you imagine? You'd go insane. And that's why I actually think the smartest thing Meghan can do is exactly what she's doing. Live her life. Let the people who actually know her speak for themselves. Let the people who have real relationships with her demonstrate those relationships naturally, and let the headlines scream into the void. Because eventually people start noticing the pattern. They start asking, why does every tiny thing involving Meghan always have to become evidence that she's failing? That's when the audience becomes more skeptical, not because somebody told them to be skeptical, because they've seen the pattern for themselves. And that's the real danger for this kind of reporting. The more often you try to convince people that Meghan is unwanted, the more people may start asking why you're so determined to prove it. Because if Meghan were truly as irrelevant, isolated and forgotten as some commentators constantly claim, why are they studying her every move? Why are they watching who she speaks to? Why are they analysing who walks past her? Why are they turning seconds of footage into entire articles? Why are they still so invested? That's the contradiction. And Squaddies, I think that's where this story really lands. The David Foster clip didn't prove Meghan was isolated. It showed how quickly a completely ordinary moment can be recruited into a story about Meghan that was already written long before the camera started rolling. And once you see that, you stop asking, why did Meghan get snubbed? And you start asking the much better question, why were they so desperate to make people believe she was? Now, that is the conversation worth having.
Now, Squaddies, this is where I want to bring the whole thing home. Because after all this noise, all these headlines, all these dramatic captions, and all this detective work over a couple of seconds of video, here's what we're left with. Meghan does not need the British media to explain her life to her. She doesn't. And I think that's something people sometimes forget. Meghan doesn't have to sit down every morning and say, right, what are they saying about me today? Who apparently hates me? Who supposedly snubbed me? Who did I supposedly upset? Imagine living like that. You'd need 3 phones, 2 assistants, and a very strong cup of coffee just to keep up. But Meghan doesn't have to play that game. If somebody doesn't shake her hand in a 2-second clip, she doesn't need to release a statement. If somebody looks in another direction, she doesn't need to call a press conference. If a tabloid decides she's supposedly isolated, she doesn't need to start producing a friendship spreadsheet. Dear British press, please find attached 17 photographs proving I have friends. No, that's not how life works. And honestly, I think regular people understand this better than the people writing these stories. You know your life. You know who your friends are. You know who checks on you when you're having a bad day. You know who was there when things were difficult. You don't need some stranger online to tell you whether your friendships are real. And Meghan is entitled to exactly the same thing. That's why this whole David Foster situation is so revealing, because the story was trying to tell people, look at Meghan, she's being rejected. But when you step back and actually look at what happened, the story becomes, why are people so desperate to prove that Meghan is being rejected? That's a completely different question. And I think that's the question people should be asking. Because once a particular narrative has been repeated enough times, people can start believing it without ever stopping to check the original evidence. Someone says Meghan was snubbed, another outlet repeats it, someone on social media reacts to that article, then another commentator talks about the reaction, and suddenly we've got 20 stories about an event that basically didn't happen. That's how nonsense grows legs. It's like that childhood game where one person whispers something into another person's ear, and by the time it reaches the last person,
person, the sentence is completely different. Except now there's a headline, a thumbnail, and thousands of angry comments attached to it. And Meghan doesn't have to chase every single version of the story. That's the freedom here. She can just keep living, keep working, keep showing up, keep spending time with the people she actually cares about, and let the people who genuinely know her speak for themselves. Because ultimately, real life is louder than a headline. You can write Meghan is isolated 1,000 times. That doesn't magically make it true. You can take another random photograph. You can freeze another awkward second. You can zoom in on another facial expression. But none of that gives you access to someone's actual relationships. And here's the irony, Squaddies. The people trying hardest to convince everyone that Meghan is unwanted may actually be doing the opposite. They're keeping her name in the conversation. They're watching where she goes. They're watching who she talks to. They're watching who stands beside her. They're watching her clothes, her events, her friendships, her family, her business projects. They are paying a lot of attention to somebody they keep telling us nobody cares about. Make that make sense. And that's why I don't think Meghan needs to prove anything here. She doesn't need to win an argument with a tabloid. She doesn't need to convince every critic. She doesn't need to explain every friendship. She certainly doesn't need to defend herself against a 2-second video that somebody else decided to turn into a scandal. Her real life is the answer. The people around her are the answer. The relationships that existed before the headline are the answer. And if David Foster says there was no snub and speaks warmly about Meghan, I'll take that over somebody's dramatic social media caption any day of the week. So Squaddies, let's remember what this story actually showed us. It didn't expose Meghan's supposed lack of friends. It exposed something much more interesting, how badly some parts of the media still need Meghan to look rejected. Because if the truth is simply that Meghan walked onto a red carpet, enjoyed her evening and continued living her life, there's no scandal there, there's no humiliation, there's no dramatic downfall, there's just Meghan being Meghan. And maybe that's the part that frustrates them the most. Because Meghan doesn't need their permission to have a life, she doesn't need their approval to have friends, and she certainly doesn't need their headlines to tell her who she is. Thank you all for watching. I'm your host Miles. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Catch you all in the next one, and goodbye.